My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And welcome to the virtual reading group. It's the summer of 2022, and we are enjoying reading together these last interviews, these 4 interviews of Hannah Arendt's that are collected in this little book, The Last Interviews and Other Conversations. It's a wonderful collection, and I hope you're all enjoying it. I think it's a perfect summer reading. One note for our regulars and those who will be our regulars, we've been talking a lot about what we might read next, and I think there've been a couple of ideas on the table, but I think the idea that has gotten a lot of support and is one of the few sort of big books left that we haven't read of her writings is the Jewish writings, edited by a few people, and Jerome Cohn and others. And I was wondering, maybe people can send me an email or send Phil an email and let us know what you think of that idea. Or maybe at the end today, I'll give us a couple minutes to hear people's thoughts on it. But that was the thought, and we would start that either in September or late September, because I'm traveling a lot in September, but we'll see. So tell me if you have other ideas. Let me know. Great. So as I said, we're reading the Jewish the Last Interview and Other Conversations. Today we're reading the second interview. It's an interview by the German journalist Joachim Fest on the German TV show Das Thema, the theme, from Südwestrundfunk, the Southwest German TV station. It's originally published in this little book, this other book, Hannah Arendt, Joachim Fest, Eichmann war von Empörter Dummheit, Gespräche und Briefe. And it's actually a wonderful book, if you read German, of conversations and letters between Arendt and Joachim Fest. This particular interview, I will say, is one of my favorites. It's one that I've used and cited numerous times when I've written about Arendt and Eichmann, and we'll see why. But in my view, one of the classic Arendt conversations you have with people is, banality of evil. What did she mean? Did she mean this? Did she mean that? And in many ways, I think in this interview with Fest, Arendt gets closer to sort of saying what she actually means in a non-academic way about the banality of evil than in any other interview. And let's just go there, because it's certainly something we're going to talk about. And it's in an exchange that begins more or less on page 43 of the English. This is, Arendt is here. It's very close to the beginning, but let's just follow through this discussion, because I think it's actually a really important discussion. As I'm saying, I think this is probably the single most insightful series of pages Arendt ever has on what she actually means by the banality of evil. So starting on page 43, Fest asks Arendt, if these trials, and he's talking about the Nuremberg trials in Germany and the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, have brought to light a new type of criminal. And so the first step in this argument is Arendt says, yes, there is indeed a new type of criminal. And the point she makes here is that Eichmann did not have criminal motives, right? you know, I got into a nasty public conversation once with somebody who cited this and said that what Arendt said is that Eichmann was not guilty or that he had no evil in him. That's not what she's saying at all. Clearly, if you read her book, she thinks Eichmann was guilty, and she says it again here. And she also thinks that he had a kind of evil in him, the banality. What she says, he has no criminal motives. What does that mean? It means that he didn't have, in law, we call mens rea, a guilty mind. He didn't think about doing something that was criminal or wrong. What did he do? As she says, he wanted to go along with the rest. He wanted to say we. In German, going along with the rest is mitmachen, to make with others, to do with others. So the original, that's what she says. The translation, it says go along with others, which I think is fine. But it's actually going to be important to hear the German mitmachen, because when she then says in the next paragraph that going along with others produces power, right? Power in German is Macht. And so power comes from mitmachen, making and doing things with others. And so she says that what Eichmann says on 43 in the next paragraph, I'd like to say, you see, that is that going along with the rest, mitmachen, that kind of going along that involves lots of people acting together produces power, macht. So long as you're not alone, you're always powerless. As long as you're alone, you're always powerless, however strong you may be. This going along with others that she thinks is Eichmann's real motive, and not a kind of, and there's nothing criminal in going along with others. And then she says this wonderful thing at the bottom of page 43. She says, power, this feeling of power that arises from acting together is absolutely not wrong in itself. It's a general human feeling, but it's not good either. It's simply neutral. And I think this is something important to remember, because Arendt, as many of us know, is a thinker of action, and action is a form of acting together with others. It's a form of power. And there's sometimes a tendency in Arendt's scholarship to think all action is good. She doesn't think so, right? She thinks it's a human phenomena to act. And she thinks Hitler was an actor. Eichmann was an actor. You can be an actor and be very bad. You can be an actor and be very good. It's neutral. So she's saying that Eichmann acted not out of criminal motives. He didn't want to kill people. That wasn't his goal. Similarly, he wasn't someone who wanted to kill the Jews. So at the bottom of the next paragraph on page 44, she'll say, ideology, in my view, didn't play a very big role here, right? Ideology, anti-Semitism, which she calls a secular ideology, didn't play a very big role. Now, I think to be careful here, she doesn't say ideology didn't play any role or anti-Semitism didn't play any role. And so you'll see some people falsely say that Arendt says Eichmann was not an anti-Semite. She never says that, never says that. And I don't think she believes that. But I think what she does believe is that to the extent Eichmann was an anti-Semite, it didn't play a very big role in what he did. There are many racists in the world, but they're different from people who commit racist acts or racist violence. And in this case, what she's saying is Eichmann may have been an anti-Semite, but the anti-Semitism is not what led him to do what he did. he wasn't an ideological anti-Semite, and he didn't have criminal motives. So what really drove him to act in the way he did, to this mitmachen, this going along? And this is where we need to look on top of page 44, where she says, in acting in this way, there's an extreme feeling of pleasure, right? An extreme feeling of pleasure. I won't start quoting reams of material here. You could go on quoting examples from the American Revolution for hours at a time. And I'd say that the really perverse form of acting is functioning. And in this functioning, the feeling of pleasure is always there. So what she's saying is that what made Eichmann act, go along with mitmachen, was an extreme feeling of pleasure in going along with, in this functioning. And in this functioning, there's a pleasure. And she opposes this functioning then to acting. She says everything in action is also there in acting together with others. So functioning is a kind of action. It's action together with others. It's mitmachen. But in acting, she says, there's discussing things. There's reaching certain decisions. There's accepting responsibility. There's thinking about what we are doing. All of which, she says, are eliminated in mitmachen, in just functioning, in mere functioning. And what you have in mere functioning, she says in the translation in your book, it says mere freewheeling. I don't know what that means. But in German, it's reinen Leerlauf. It's a pure empty going. And it's this pure empty going, which gets translated as freewheeling. That is it's a pleasure in just being drawn along with the crowd and being part of a crowd. And she says, and the pleasure in this mere functioning, this reinen Leerlauf, this pleasure was quite evident in Eichmann. And so the first step of the argument about Eichmann here, about banality of evil, is this, right? It's that he was a new type of criminal in the sense that he didn't have criminal motives. He acted out of a pure love of simply going along with the crowd, of being a we, and that there was a joy and a pleasure in being part of a we that drove Eichmann forward, and that his action was in the sense of a mere functioning. Okay, so that's the first step in the argument here that she develops, that I think is not really something she ever developed anywhere else. That's why I think this is such an important interview and an essay for, or not essay, interview. If you're interested in understanding what she means by the banality of evil. The second step is that she then talks about evil in the next 2 pages, 44 to 46. And she says that, evil is much more interesting than goodness. Goodness is sort of flat, whereas evil, at least a demonic evil, is quite different. And she says that the devil is more interesting than St. Peter, than a good angel. The fallen angel has depth. You can, it's much easier to write a story about devils than it is about angels. At least that's her argument, and I think it's probably true. She says at the bottom of 45 that when you get the same situation in philosophy, the negative is the only thing that gives any impetus to history. This is of course, a citation, This is a citation of Hegel, and Hegel's idea of negation. Negation is the driver of history in Hegel, because it's what makes history happen. History, if it's all the same, if it's all just positive, nothing ever happens. It's only when there's a negation that we end up with motion in history. And she says, Eichmann was not demonic. He was not deep. this is a prelude to things she said elsewhere, that what Eichmann was banal, not deep. And so that's the sort of second, I think, important reading of Eichmann here in this text. The third, which takes place on 47 to 48, is she says, look, there were some misunderstandings that people had about her book. And the most important one, she says, is that people thought that when she called Eichmann banal, she called it commonplace. And they thought that she meant that there's a little Eichmann in all of us, which is something that some of the reviewers, and still today, some people say she meant. And she says clearly on 47, I didn't mean in the least that there's an Eichmann in all of us, or that each of us has an Eichmann in him, and the devil knows what else. Far from it. And so she then, so just to be clear about that, this is an argument that many people make, that that Arendt says that Eichmann was, banal. We all are like Eichmann. We all could have done what Eichmann did. That's exactly the opposite of what she's trying to argue. In fact, what she says is, what Eichmann is guilty because he gave into temptation. He did what he did. He did what he knew was wrong. And most of us might have the same temptations to go along with the flow, to be a mitmacher, but we don't all do it. And that's what we have to understand. And that's why when you call people before a judge, they're no longer a mitmacher, they're no longer a bureaucrat, they're a human being, and they are responsible for what they have done. So what does she mean by banality? So here's the part of this text that to me is the most extraordinary, and it's the reason that I cite this text a lot in order to understand and explain to people what she means by banality of evil. So on the bottom of 47, about 4 lines from the bottom, she says, let me tell you what I mean by banality. Right? Here's she's going to tell you what she means by it. And again, she's never said it so clearly. She says, in Jerusalem, I remembered the story of Ernst Jünger, once told that I'd forgotten. Ernst Jünger is a brilliant German writer. One of his best books is Auf dem Marmorklippen, or On the Marbled Cliffs, which is written in the early 30s, and it is an allegory of the rise of Nazism. If you're interested in the rise of Nazism, there's probably no better book to read about how it happens than Auf dem Marmorklippen, or On the Marbled Cliffs. Highly short, it's a little parable, highly recommended for your beach reading this summer. And it's a harrowing book, but it's also spectacular. He's someone who fought in World War I and was a war hero. And many of these soldiers took his books with them in World War II. And it's one of the reasons he's been, he's very nationalistic, very conservative. And he's, while he was never a Nazi, certainly has been considered a German nationalist, and some people have considered him to be tarred by Nazism. But we'll leave that for now. It's one of the reasons many people think he didn't win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Anyway, she says in this story, and I'm just going to read the story because I think it's the way she tells it is so important for an understanding of what she means by banality. She writes on, this is from bottom of 47 and then mostly on 48. During the war, and this is World War II, Ernst Jünger came across some peasants in Pomerania or Mecklenburg. No, I think it was Pomerania. And then the editors tell you the story was told in Strahlungen, which is a book of memoirs about World War II, and an extraordinary book in its own right. No, I think it was in Pomerania. And a peasant had taken in Russian prisoners of war straight from the camps. And naturally, these prisoners of war were completely starving. You know how Russian prisoners of war were treated here. And he says to Junger, the peasant says to Junger, quote, well, they're Untermenschen, subhuman. Untermenschen is the word she uses in German. And like cattle, it's easy to see they eat the pig's food. And Junger comments on this story, quote, it's sometimes as if the German people were being ridden by the devil. And he didn't mean anything demonic by that. You see, there's something outrageously stupid about this story. I mean, the story is stupid, so to speak. The man doesn't see that this is just what starving people do, right? And anyone would behave like that. But there's something really outrageous about this stupidity. Eichmann was perfectly intelligent, but in this respect, he was stupid. It was this stupidity that was so outrageous. And that was what I actually meant by banality. There's nothing deep about it, nothing demonic. There's simply the reluctance ever to imagine what the other person is experiencing, right? How many times does she use the word stupid in this paragraph? Dummheit. And the adjective that she uses is emporrende, an outrageous dumbheit, an outrageous stupidity. And this is what she meant by banality, she tells us. The reluctance to imagine what the other person is experiencing. So you have these prisoners of war who've been in a camp and starving, and a peasant takes them in, an act of humanity, and they get down on the floor and they start eating what's on the floor like pigs. And he says, huh, they're Untermensch, they're subhuman, they're like cattle. And it's that stupidity. What's the stupidity? It's the reluctance to imagine the other person's experience. Now, for you Arendtians, you all know what she's talking about. It's the reluctance to think. It's the reluctance to think, which means to expand your mentality and to think from the perspective of the others. And this is what she meant by banality. What Eichmann's banality was that he was a mitmacher. He went along with the crowd. He went along with what was going on, and he never stopped to think, and he never stopped to think from the perspective of the others, which is what allows him to think, oh, I'm helping the Jews get out of Germany, at least at the beginning. It's this stupidity. It's like that she is interested in. Okay, I don't want to beat this stupidity into the ground. But to me, it's the reason I read this, come back to this particular interview over and over again, and find it so incredible. I think there's another part I'll point your attention to, which is the discussion on 52, actually 50 to 54, 55, about obedience and remorse. And what she really says about Eichmann is that he was someone who just wanted to go along. And that's the way she sees it. This is on 53. And she says, he felt wonderfully happy in Jerusalem. There's no question about it, is there? The superior was Landau, namely Moshe Landau, the head justice of the Israeli court. And what she's saying is that Eichmann was someone who always wanted to obey, always wanted to follow orders, whether that was Hitler or Himmler or Heydrich or Moshe Landau. Or even Captain Abner Less, the captain who interrogated him, who she says Eichmann was so incredibly intent on impressing and answering all his questions. He was someone who simply loved to be obedient and do what was right, or what he was told. Bettina Stengnath, will read this very differently. She'll say that Eichmann was a manipulator who manipulated Landau and manipulated Less and simply did so intentionally and made it seem like he was, obedient and helping them, but was really simply trying to manipulate the court. Clearly, Arendt doesn't agree with that, and we can discuss it further if you're interested in. They come back to the question of responsibility on page 54, and this will lead us also to the question of bureaucracy. The key part that I think we need to understand is that for Arendt, even in a totalitarian state, there is legal and moral responsibility. And this is what she's expressing on page 54, where she says, when we put people on trial, we ascribe responsibility to them, and we have a right to do so from the legal standpoint. We have the right, since the alternative was not martyrdom. There was an alternative on both sides. You didn't have to go along. You could make up your own mind. Thanks anyway, but I'm not going along. I'm not risking my life. I'm trying to get away. I'm trying to see if I can slip off. So you could simply try. You might not succeed. You might be killed, but you didn't have to martyr yourself. You could try to slip off and not mitmachen, to not go along with the others. And when you're brought before a court, she says, you're no longer a functionary or a bureaucrat. You're a human being again. And then she says again this line, which she mentions in a couple of her books. We read it quite recently, where she says there's an abyss between those who have evil thoughts and think about doing evil and those who actually do it. And that's where Eichmann is guilty. And that's why she says we shouldn't say that all Germans are guilty, because some may have gone along with the crowd, but they didn't do what Eichmann did. It's the same reason we shouldn't say all Russians are guilty right now. It's the same reason she says numerous times we shouldn't say all white people are guilty of racism. Yeah, it may be that many white people have prejudices. Many Russians may not like Ukrainians, I don't know. But there's an abyss between those who have the thoughts and those who carry them out. And that's why she is against the idea of collective guilt. What else do we want to? I've already talked for a long time. The last thing I guess I'll mention, because it's a little different, is in the last 2-3 pages, Fest raises this question of whether we should always tell the truth, and did she make a mistake in telling her truth about the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem? And she says, this is really the only question in the whole controversy that is actually of interest to me. And for those of you who know, she wrote the essay Truth in Politics, which we've read and is published in Beyond, Between Past and Future, as an answer to that question, right? As an attempt to answer that question. And in that essay, she says something which she doesn't say here, which is she says that truth is the one thing that's maybe worth dying for, right? So she takes the idea of fiat justitia periat mundi, do justice, let the world be damned, let the world be lost. And she says, no, right? We'd rather preserve the world than do justice, because if you want justice, losing the world is not going to get you there. But she says, if you take the similar phrase, fiat veritas periat mundus, let truth be done, even if the world perishes. She said that actually makes sense, because if you lose truth, if you lose the common world, if you lose what we stand on together in which we can share, then there's no world in which we can build justice or truth or anything. And so what she's answering here is that there have to be people, she says to Fest here, who at the time are independent, who live at the time and are independent. And it's their task to be the guardians of factual truths. And she says that in her reporting on the Eichmann trial, that's what she was doing. She then makes a distinction and says, truths are not the same as feelings. And there are people whose feelings she hurt. And while she doesn't feel bad about telling truths that might be misused by some people, she does at times feel bad about wounding people's feelings. And one of the things that, it's true about Arendt is almost all the letters written to her about the trial, whereas, she got thousands of them, but she tried to answer the ones that were angry, where people thought she'd hurt their feelings. And she tried to, and she really was, I think, moved by that. And I think that's what she's responding to here. And she says the only legitimate feeling that she really does recognize in this matter is sorrow, not self-congratulation. And very few people understand this. There's nothing I can do about it. In fact, in my opinion, people shouldn't adopt an emotional tone to talk about these things, since that's a way of playing them down. But she does understand a certain sorrow around these matters, and she thinks that's a legitimate feeling. All right, I'll stop there. And as I said, I love this sort of interview. I think Fest is a great interviewer, and obviously someone who brings out some of the best in Hannah Arendt. You can engage in a respectful, I hope, dialogue with each other in the chat. Please keep it about ideas. And you can also raise your hand with the little raise your hand button under the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. And I will recognize you in the order you do that. And I look forward to the conversation. All right. First, it's Vivian. How you doing, Vivian?
Hi. Can you hear me?
I can hear you great.
Hi. Thanks. I have to say that I know this interview. I've listened to it many times over the last couple of years, and it's fantastic. There are other interviews, and I've listened to the French one. This one is very special. I know they had a special relationship. They share something in their background, but I don't know what, on his father's generation, but I can't remember what it was. In any case, there's more than meets the eye there between them. But I put my hand up because I want to try and tell a joke, if that's okay. I'm not good at that, but it's a fabulous joke. I won't be able to recreate it, but I'll give you some idea. It was told to me about, I don't know, at least 26 years ago, by a Viennese Jew called Henry Feiwel, who was a very big art collector in the 1970s in New York. And we had become friends in the late 80s when he had come to my studio downtown. And he was a fascinating man. At that point, he was old. He died in the year 2000. He was already in his 80s. So he would be, 100 something today. Anyway, he was brilliant at telling jokes, and all the best, German Jewish jokes, I think, are Viennese. There was also that very famous Viennese comic who was actually performing in the camps. Do you remember? I forget his name now. He was very famous before the war, and he was famous in performing for the Nazi staff and everyone on, underneath scaffolding and stuff. Very, very dark jokes. So this one, anyway, so Henry told this joke to me. He was very good at telling the jokes, but it had to do with mitmachen. That's why I want to tell it. And it really explains several sides of Mitmachen. So there's a very crowded bus, I think in Berlin or something, during the, the height of the Nazi time. And very crowded, and any Jew who would dare to get on that bus would be an idiot. But anyway, there is a Jew who did dare to get onto the bus, and he gets onto the crowded bus, and he sees, of course, these Nazis in uniform, and they're pushing everyone out the way, and they're looking at people, and they're thinking that they are less than human, and one Jew in particular, and he gets absolutely clobbered by a Nazi boot, and this Jew gets on the bus. And he sees what's going on, and I'll sort of make it short. And he fights to the back, and he goes up to the big uniformed Nazi, and he stomps as hard as he can on this boot. And everyone's looking at him like he's crazy. What, are you suicidal? He says, no. He says, ich dachte, ich mache mit. And I didn't tell it well, but it's an amazing joke.
Great. But for people who don't speak German, what he said was, I just thought I would mitmachen. I would go along with it.
I'd go along with it. Yeah. Sorry, I'd go along with it. And by the way, Henry Feiwel was a person who had been in Dachau in its earliest days with his own father. His father had not made it out of there, and Henry Feiwel did, and that was like the bane of his existence ever after. And he eventually he'd come to America, where he'd like to be known as Hank, and he'd made a lot of money in the textile industry. But anyway, so that's the joke. That's what I wanted to share with you.
I think the idea of going along with mitmachen and the pleasure of going along with it, is one that it's so easy for us to talk about. We talk about movements, and you all know I've talked a lot about movements and how we live in a time of movements, partly because we live in an age of loneliness and purposelessness. And it's easy to think, oh, they're going along with. And I think what's nice about that joke and wonderful about that joke is that it reminds us that going along with happens on many different ways, but also there's a kind of a beautiful, thoughtful critique of it in that it's just easy to critique people for going along with, and hard to often look at ourselves. And I think that's important. So thank you. It's a great, I'm going to have to remember that joke, and I'm terrible at remembering jokes, so I'm going to try. Ted. You gotta unmute.
Okay, I thought this was your most brilliant lecture. I did. I thought it was the lecture that you got most of you in it. And that's my comment. Also, it's also the lecture that made Hannah Arendt Moore most alive to me, because she related to so many psychological theories. You can see her relating to Kohlberg's theories of moral development, and where you can see Mr. Eichmann in the conventional of the many level of moral development. She relates to Piaget's notions of the many. She also, you talk about his primary motivation is going to pleasure, but isn't that true of all human nature? Don't we all act towards pleasure and away from pain? So that's my question to you.
Thank you. Well, I mean, there's a utilitarian view offered by people like Bentham and Mill that, we should act for the greatest, maximize pleasure and minimize pain. But of course, we don't always do that. They think we have to be led to do that. And there are all sorts of things that I think lead us to act away from pleasure. Duty. The whole idea of duty is supposed to lead you away from pleasure, although you could say there's a pleasure in obedience too.
Excuse me, isn't it? But the main core of B.F. Skinner's theory, the main core of Freud's theory and other psychological theory is that we act to what is pleasurable to us, to what makes us pleasure, and we work away from pain.
Well, okay. I mean, I don't think you can compare, I don't think you can equate Skinner and Freud.
Oh. On that issue, you can.
What?
I think on that issue, working towards pleasure, you can.
Okay, maybe, but very different kinds of pleasure.
Well, it depends to some degree. I don't have my face because I'm recovering or suffering with COVID. This is Jay. But if you get pleasure out of being a moral person, then there can be an approach toward pleasure in doing something that's difficult. If you want to learn at a more mundane level to play piano or to read a difficult book, you know, you're at the moment maybe moving away from instant pleasure, but there's a deeper, gratifying, satisfying pleasure of sticking with and revolving around your sense of self that's based on some kind of anchoring in morality.
I think what you're saying, Jay and Ted, is that there are different kinds of pleasure, right? I mean, I can act for pleasure of instant gratification. I can act for pleasure of being dutiful. I can act for pleasure that I'm going to be remembered well in history. I can act out of lust. I mean, there's all sorts of different pleasures. So what she's not saying here is that Eichmann, you know, that some people act out of pleasure and some people don't. What she's saying is a typical criminal, if we think of a typical criminal in our legal system and in our Western morality, we think of a criminal who acts out of, let's call it the pleasure of pride, right? That's the way our criminal legal system understands it. It's someone who thinks they have the right to set themselves above the law and steal. They know that it's against the law to steal, but they steal because they think they have the right to. That's hubris or pride. They know murder is illegal, but they think, well, this person is the person who killed my child, so I have the right to kill them. And so, as Hegel would say in his legal philosophy, crime is pride. And that's the typical criminal. And the pleasure of the criminal, therefore, is the pleasure of elevating oneself above. What Arendt is here saying about Eichmann is that the pleasure is not pride. It's mitmachen. It's losing oneself with others. It's the pleasure in acting with and being part of a crowd. It's the pleasure in having an identity with others. So it's almost the opposite of the criminal. If the criminal is about the individual pride, the Eichmann motive is to sort of lose oneself in a movement. I don't know, Ted. I saw. What do you want to? I mean, I think that's how I understand the difference here. So she's not saying there's not that people act not out of pleasure. It's just there's different pleasures, and Eichmann's pleasure is not your typical criminal pleasure.
I just think that of the many, in a sense of belonging, is a pleasure that most people do because it's at a very immature or very low level. It's kind of, I'm trying to express myself. I'm trying to get to it, but it would be in any hierarchy of psychology, right in the middle. A sense of belonging talks about Maslow, that's in the middle. It's not a high, as most people in this group, in fact, everybody in this group are a high level of maturity. You could say that Eichmann was at a low level of maturity in a developmental sense. So, and yet he acted in pleasure, but we all act in pleasure. It's just pleasurable to be here on a Friday afternoon with people like you.
Well, no, I obviously have pleasure in being with you guys as well. So I thank you for that. But I guess what I want to say is, I don't know if she thinks of Eichmann as, I mean, she never talks about it as mature or immature, which doesn't mean that's not how she thinks about it. What does she think about Eichmann? She thinks he's someone who is alone and needed to belong. and that his pleasure was a pleasure of going along with. You know, I don't, I could see how you would call that immature. She calls it, I think, the increasingly common characteristic of masses of people in our modern world. Yeah. Okay. Monica, you're up next.
Thank you. I also really enjoyed this interview, and part of it was I felt there was this comfort level between Joachim Fest and Hannah Arendt, that I felt like she was able to be comfortable in expressing her views. But the thing I wanted to comment on is, as I was reading this interview, I felt a lot of my imagination was really stirred as I reflected upon what's happening now with the January 6th hearings, where I don't know if anybody's been tuning into those, but where you have this mass of people that went along.
Amen.
First of all, belonging to a group, and then also the bureaucracy, the people within the White House, who still many have not been able to express the full truth of what happened. I just felt a lot of parallels, and so many of the quotes, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like, for example, where she says, the bureaucracy, in other words, she's talking about the bureaucracy, the individual person is extinguished. And as soon as the person concerned appears in front of the judge, he becomes a human being again. And this is actually what is so splendid about the legal system, isn't it? A real transformation takes place. For if the person then says, but I was just a bureaucrat, the judge can say, hey, listen, that's not why we're here. You're standing here because you're a human being and because you did certain things. And there's something splendid about this transformation. And I thought, wow, what a brilliant quote. And also, like, what a brilliant expression of what happened within this movement that took place, that culminated in January 6th. We had a bunch of people going along with the movement that had excited their imagination and their passions for 4 years. And then in the aftermath, now, as you deconstruct what happened, they're reduced back into these people, which I also found very fascinating as she discussed the banality of evil and witnessing Eichmann as a man who looked ill and behind this bulletproof barrier and didn't look, in other words, his frailty and the power of the we and the power of the group goes away, and you just have someone there standing responsible for their actions outside of any ability to exculpate themselves based on some grander scheme. So anyway, I thought it was brilliant, and I am just really enjoying these readings this summer.
Yes. Well, thank you, Monica. I agree. I mean, I think it's really wonderful to read these interviews, and, not all philosophers, I think, are great on their feet in interviews. But one of the things about Arendt is somehow she is. And it's really wonderful to see. The quote that Monica was reading is on page 59. And in case anyone wants to look at it. And I think it is a beautiful and important quote. It was one of the things I wanted to talk about at enough time, so I'm glad you brought it back to our attention, Monica. There's something splendid about this transformation. And it's the transformation when you take a bureaucrat and put them in front of a court of law. And as Monica read, you appear in front of a judge and you become a human being again. You can't say, I was just doing my job. I'm just a bureaucrat. The judge can say, that's not why you're here. You're here because you are a person. And I think the lesson Monica drew from the hearings is right on. There are a lot of people who continue to act like bureaucrats, who continue to act like members of a certain political party, the Republican Party, and continue to simply say what they need to say as members of that party. And then there are others, some to a greater and some to a lesser degree, that have become human beings again. And that's the beauty of a legal system, or a system of, in this sense, congressional investigation, where people are brought to testify not as a bureaucrat, but as a human being. And it does remind us, right, that people can escape from being, playing their role, being a bureaucrat. It also reminds us how hard it is. I think both those things are lessons we probably have to take from this whole sordid escapade that we're witnessing unfold between us. But I think it's a absolutely essential insight. So thank you. Nolan. You got to unmute, Nolan.
Better?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes. I want to say thanks to Roger Berkowitz for establishing and creating this Hannah Arendt Center. I can't say enough appreciative words about that, because it has been very meaningful to me as an individual.
Well, thank you. I don't know if it's my birthday or not, but I appreciate all the kind words today.
I was interested in the response to the shootings, the school shootings, and what some people have offered as explanations. And Malcolm Gladwell was referred to in an article, and I've been trying to search for that article. I can't find it. I apologize for that. But he likened the shootings to a riot where one person has to swing the brick while others are observing and are very hesitant until there is a crowd and one can go along with it. In the writing of his piece, he describes a young man who has a backpack. He's moving through a neighbor's yard and going to, I think, a storage center. And in doing so, she calls the police, and they proceed to go to this storage center, open it up, and there in the middle of it is this 17-year-old young man, and he's got all kinds of bombing equipment, and they start asking him questions, and he begins to answer. He answers all the questions they ask him, and he's later put on trial, and he's discovered to be autistic. And I'm just wondering, could we put Eichmann on the autistic spectrum?
I don't know. I don't have any reason to think Eichmann was autistic first. And I don't know what would be, I'm not sure what would be gained by thinking of Eichmann as autistic. I mean, but I think it's a counterfactual. I've seen video. I mean, it's possible he was on the spectrum, and I don't know. I'm not sure what's gained from putting him on the spectrum or not. I don't know enough about autism. I don't think there's any reason to believe that people with autism have less ability to be independent of thoughts. In fact, I don't see any reason to believe that. Is that what you're suggesting, Nolan, or not? Maybe I'm misunderstanding.
No, just asking the question because of the way he was seeming to answer all the questions and perhaps being somewhat cooperative, as this young 17-year-old was. It just came, the question just came to my mind. Is there anything about Eichmann that be construed as being on the autistic spectrum? That's all, just a question.
You know, I mean, if you look at him at the trial and you see the pictures and the video of him, he's obviously got a lot of tics and quirks, but I'm not a psychiatrist, and I have no reason to believe that, but you know, I can't say much about it.
May I say something to that? I have close contact with someone who is autistic, and I agree with Roger, though there's no point in inserting him there, because where's that going to get us? I do think that that he does, Eichmann comes off very much as being on the, what's often called on the spectrum, but he was obviously very high functioning, because if you're not high functioning, you can't function in a job. So he's very, very high functioning. That oddly detachedness that he has, that Arendt talks about all the time in different ways, is very much like on the autistic spectrum. But again, I can't see, I mean, even if we all agree that that was the fact, he was on the spectrum, it doesn't really change anything, because he was high functioning. And so if the purpose of that would be to somehow absolve him of any guilt of not taking personal responsibility, again, I don't think that leads anywhere, really. So I just wanted to say, yeah, he was probably on the spectrum, but, you know, yeah, with Tourette's and everything else, but whatever, yeah.
Thank you, Vivian. I think Gary Patton has put a link in the text to what may be the article Nolan was referring to. So if you're interested, you can take a look at it. Okay, Jessica, you're up.
Yes. Hello, and thank you. It's my first time here, and I'm enjoying it very much. I have basically two questions. So I see a tension between what we read here in this interview and about the banality of evil, and what Arendt says in Revolution, when she talks about the darkness of the heart, and the darkness of the heart and the impossibility of judging motives, because in politics, really what matters is appearance. And every time we try to judge about the authenticity, the real motives behind the actions, really we're trying to deal with something impossible. And as I was, I've read, both books and sources various times, but it was the first time that I sort of realized that there is a tension here. Because the whole idea of the banality is about judging the motives behind. In Eichmann, how he was not moved by any criminal motives, how he was not, how it was. So I'm
sorry, go ahead, finish up.
I know, I just read the message that the voice is breaking up. Sorry.
No,
so I that's one thing that I don't know, I wanted to ask you, how would you think of that? And I have a second sort of question or comment also that I would like to bring, that has to do with this. That I also like a lot the part of the pleasure and the joy on acting together, and how it can be in many ways of acting together. So it's also part of, of action in this strong sense, or revolutionary action. But if we turn it, we could also say how it also shows light in how going along and being probably just follower can also be a part of how action takes place, of how that the possibility of initiating something collectively by acting together may involve, to some extent, just followers, or acting by this sort of what we could call today probably more like cascade mechanisms. And I also wanted to know what you think about, because it seems to me that when we start thinking about that, we can romanticize action less. I mean, when we start to think of the mechanism of how collective action or acting together with others can take place, then we stop sort of romanticizing this idea of I don't know, strongly initiating all the time, or each of us. I don't know. Just wanted to hear your thoughts on both things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome. First of all, they're fantastic questions, and I really appreciate them. So the first question, Jessica's referring to a section near the end of the chapter on the social question in On Revolution, where Arendt is talking about the phenomenon of hypocrisy. What she cites the famous or infamous, or I don't know what the right, famous or infamous, saying that hypocrisy is the complement vice pays to virtue. And what she's saying is that in politics, people act out of all sorts of interests. Why is somebody, to just use a, why are people trying to overturn Roe v. Wade and ban abortion? You may think, but what actually drives the dark heart inside of us, as Jessica cited, is dark not only to others, but often to ourselves. We don't know the interests that drive us. So if somebody does something bad in politics, let's say, takes some money or is corrupt or whatever, there's immediately or wants to or has a policy, let's say, get rid of immigrants. There's one that I think a lot of you will agree with. And it's easy to say, they're evil. And yet what Arendt is saying is, we rarely know what drives people, A, and B, we don't know if they're acting out of bad motives or good motives, or they really believe different things or whatever. And so if you try and moralize politics, if you try and call everyone a hypocrite, because everyone will act out of strange motives and do things that might be seen as hypocritical. No one's ever going to be completely honest and consistent in politics. If you try and drive out all hypocrisy, you'll end up with the French Revolution. You'll have a terror and you get rid of everybody, because who in politics is always saying what they truly believe, let alone knowing what they truly believe. And so you can't expect pure motives in politics. That's the upshot of it to some degree, and we shouldn't moralize politics. Jessica's saying, isn't that at tension with Arendt's claim here that the typical legal approach of a criminal idea is to ask after their intent, their mens rea? And the answer is, well, yes, but no, because there's a difference between law and politics, right? In politics, we can't moralize. We can't demand a kind of non-hypocrisy. We can't hold people responsible for their intentions. We rather just focus on their actions. But in law, we do care about their intentions. We have traditionally said that in order to commit a crime, there are two necessary elements. There's something called actus reus, the guilty act, and mens rea, the guilty mind. And what we say is you need a guilty mind as well as a guilty act to be guilty. And we do that because if we're going to punish someone in law, we want to punish them not simply because they've done a bad act, but because they actually, and here's back to what I said before, they had the hubris or the pride to elevate themselves above the law and think they had a right to break the law. And that's what mens rea is in the traditional legal Christian Western philosophic tradition of legal thinking. Part of the problem, part of the reason this is not a contradiction is because on Revolution, she's talking about politics, and here she's talking about law, and they're different areas. Does that make sense, Jessica?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, I mean, your other question, I was so interested by your first question and was thinking about it that I have to admit I wasn't fully able to focus on your second question about action. Can you rephrase it briefly?
Yes. Just a second. It referred to how when she says that action is neutral, that is not necessarily good.
Right.
And how there is pleasure in different types of action, and here she's referring to the functioning, but also to this strong sense of acting together, which would be sort of a revolutionary action. This connection, what I was just sort of saying, that it also allows us to see that how action actually works. Involves to some extent going along, and in that sense being follower. I mean, it's easy to act together. There's a dimension in which to some extent people join also as followers.
Okay, that's a really interesting question, and if you're right, it's really problematic. So let's just take that. Let's take that seriously for a moment, right? Because it's important. Arendt on page 44 of the interview in English makes this distinction between acting and acting as a functionary or functioning. And she says that acting includes discussion, taking responsibility, and thinking about what we are doing, none of which are in functioning, which is rather reinen Leerlauf, pure letting run or going along with the crowd. And she later talks about the English phrase, stop and think. So, when she talks about action in the human condition and other texts, this is actually an important caveat, I think, to what she says about action in other texts. Because she says that action is always collective action, acting together with others. And that could suggest that being a functionary is action in the Arendtian sense. But what she's saying here is that there's a difference between acting as functioning and acting itself. And now that raises interesting questions because, well, what does she say? She says that power comes from acting together with others, which is again in the human condition. But what acting itself is not going along with others. In fact, one of the very premises of action or preconditions for action is that when you act, you do something that's a new beginning, a neue Anfang, that is a spontaneous, that's new, that's natal, natality, that's surprising. And so at the very core of what she understands action to be is not mitmach, not going along with others, but acting for yourself. Power comes when we act together. Now we can act together as functionaries, or we can act together as thoughtful, discussing, responsible people who see somebody acting in a new way and thoughtfully and responsibly join in with them, not simply to go along, but because we believe that they're creating something new that matters and that is meaningful. And I think that's what she means by action. I don't think I've ever fully put it in those words before. So Jessica's question, I think, was really provocative and important for that reason, at least for me, to make that distinction. So that's how I would make that distinction.
Thank you.
Does that make sense to you, Jessica? Or do you want to follow up or respond?
I'm just wondering. So I think that your response was strongly Arendtian, in the sense of recovering what is at the heart of Arendt's notion of action. But I'm also concerned if sort of in the world, what we consider are sort of exemplary ways of what is of forms of acting together. And here, I don't know, probably in our time, I'm thinking of, I don't know, the Me Too movement as a way of people being together and initiating. I mean, yeah, being as a sort of beginning.
Take the Me Too movement, right? It's a good idea. There's a way in which when the first person announces the Me Too movement, or the first few people, or the Black Lives Matter movement, or any of these movements, these are actions. These are new, surprising, spontaneous. I'm going to enable transcription as a request of somebody. When somebody does this, they start something new. And to the extent that they do something new, people pay attention, right? This is the aesthetic nature of Arendt's politics, which we talked a lot about when we read the last book on her lecture series on Kant. And people have to take notice of it. And they can do a couple of things. They can ignore it if it's not interesting. They can criminalize it if they think it's dangerous or wrong. They can act together with that person if they think it's right and important. And at that point, it's not mitmachen, it's not going along as a functionary, because you're making a conscious decision to engage in a new kind of action. Now, at some point, a movement can emerge, like in the joke Vivian was telling, where, you know, people are stomping on people with boots, and you can go along not because you consciously think thoughtfully, think that it's a new and spontaneous and right action, but because it's just what everyone else is doing. And that's an important distinction. Obviously, there's no bright red line between these. But I think that's the important distinction that we need to understand between acting and acting as functioning that she's bringing up here. It's not a distinction she makes, as far as I know, anywhere else, but I think it's an extraordinarily important distinction. Okay.
Yep.
Is that good?
Yes, I don't want to take too much time.
It's good. But I thought they were really important questions, so I appreciate them, and hopefully, if you come back over time, we'll keep having chances to talk about them.
Perfect. Yeah, I think.
Up next is John.
I'm wondering if what I'm thinking doesn't just dovetail to what we were talking about. As I read the essay, two periods of time kept leaping into my mind in a sort of contrary way. One you just recently touched on was the evolution of the French Revolution and how it started as from a positive to end up as a negative. And the other period of time, which I lived through, and many others probably on the call lived through, was the period in the 60s of the civil rights movement into the South and through the Vietnam War. And I kept thinking, is civil disobedience, where does the line of civil disobedience cross that becomes a negative, if ever it becomes a negative? And is this when I'm reading this essay, are the correlations? I kept feeling uncertain about coming up with those correlations, but they seemed, for me, they seemed accurate. And I wonder your thoughts on where this lies, Roger.
Mhm.
Well, thanks. I mean, as I just said to Jessica, the line, there's no line or bright line that distinguishes action from functioning as action or action as functioning. I think in any movement, the origin of the movement is generally action because it's new and it's surprising and it's exciting and it pulls people in. The question is, at what point does a movement move from being an action of thoughtful discussion, discursive, responsible people who are acting based on that thought to those who simply go along and go along with.
Mhm.
I don't think there's a bright line between that. And I think maybe one of the real things that people are arguing about today in a lot of different politics is, to what extent some of these movements are actions versus functionings.
Mhm.
And I think that's a difficult matter to discuss.
Yeah.
I see about 3 hands just went up in the last couple of minutes. So let me see if I can get some of them in. Bill, and then Nancy, and then Gary.
I don't know, the machine did it itself. I'm going to not speak right now, Roger. I don't know why the hand went up. I didn't do anything, but I'm enjoying listening. Yeah.
All right. Well, good to see you, Bill.
Just for a moment, though, I want to drop this. We've been through racial reckoning, critical race theory. I don't know where it is right now with people on this call, but is it really true you said that not all what we have learned from our arts experiences, you can't say that all Germans are, and can you say that Germans have anti-Semitic feelings, but they're not all anti-Semites? Is that what I understood you were saying? And because that's a question around race in America, if you accept, as many do, that race was the glue on which our republic is based, then that means that by definition, it is a racist country. And does that, or painting everybody as racist? I'm confused about the discussion right now, but I'll just say those jagged thoughts and I'll listen to what people respond.
Well, thanks, Bill. So there's 2 distinctions, right, that I think need to be made here. One is, you said is if everyone in Germany was anti-Semitic. It's possible. Again, it's hard to know exactly what that means.
Possible.
Can just everyone, I'm just going to mute everyone so I get rid of the the echo. Um, um, but the more, you know, so I don't know if everyone in Germany was an anti-Semite, including some of the Jews, right? Because there's a claim that Jews can be anti-Semites too. But the more relevant distinction that Arendt is making is between the fact that there may be people who are anti-Semites, and we may think they're wrong to be anti-Semites, but from her point of view, being an anti-Semite in the sense that you don't like Jews is not dangerous. It may be something you disagree with. It may be wrong. It could lead to uncomfortable and bad situations, but it's not dangerous. The dangerous people are those who say and then try and act on the fact that the Jews should be kicked out of positions and eventually expelled from the country or killed. And that's where she says there's an abyss between you know, those who have dark thoughts and those who act on them. And what she's saying is, when you talk about universal guilt or collective responsibility, and you say all Germans were guilty, you lose the ability to make that distinction between the Germans who maybe had bad thoughts but didn't act on them and those who did act on them. And she says we have to be able to make that distinction, because we have to be able to punish those who acted on them. They are worse. They are impacting the world in a way that the people who just have the bad thoughts but don't act them are not. And she says in a number of her essays that we have to think about race in the United States on a similar ground. So that's the distinction she's making. Okay, Nancy, do you want to jump in? You got to unmute yourself, Nancy. I muted everybody.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking about loneliness, identity, and, you know, notions someone wrote about individuation and so on about, I was thinking about adolescence and how important being part of a we is at a certain stage of life. So I just wanted to hold on to that for a second. And then I wanted to think about being on the inside of a movement like the feminist movement or the civil rights movement, while you're in it, and say you're in a consciousness raising group in the 70s or early 70s, or one of the freedom groups, one of the groups that's talking a lot about strategies, but also about ideals in the civil rights movement, you know, both of which I felt I was a part of, and there was a lot of discussion, debate, learning going on. But the question to me, if you're inside the group and you're in the time when you're trying to make a change, has a lot to do with, let's say, leadership and where you end up in a long discussion. You can end up having takeovers by people who have needs for power, grabs for power, ego needs, stuff like that. So the dynamism of a movement is so problematic for me that it just, I feel as if Hannah Arendt is making a distinction that, as you say, there's a thin line between mitmachen and between, say, action that's thoughtful action, but when you're in on it and you're in the center of it, it's a really hard struggle to contain, to keep being creative, and to keep, I mean, right now, for example, a lot of my friends and a lot of people I know from the Hannah Arendt group, you know, we're struggling to figure out, well, what do you do when the Supreme Court acts in a certain way? What kind of action can we think up? And, you know, the need for some creativity is so acute. But then the dangers that there will be some other power grabbing person taking over is so strong. I don't know what to do about that.
Look,
It's just a whine.
it's an
I'm whining.
excellent point, Nancy. And, you know, there's two parts. One is what she would say on Eichmann is, well, for Eichmann, it's not that thin a red line, right? It's he's on
Yeah.
one side. That's, you know, and what she's saying is it was less about ideology and more about going
Yeah.
along with.
Yeah.
You know, you're right. I mean, if you're a leader of a movement, you know, one of your job is to get people to do things. And sometimes you don't care if they're very thoughtful about it. You just want them to put the bodies on the line. And, you know, I think the Arendtian answer, and I hate not that she would give, but that I'm going to give as because I don't know what she would give, is that that's always going to be a temptation. And yet, you know, the better way of going about it is doing the work of actually bringing them along thoughtfully in conversations and discussions and not engaging in mass politics. Now you can say, well, that's not going to work for me. I need to fight this battle. And I think that that's totally legitimate. There are times when you have to fight battles. But you have to be aware that when you're doing that, you're playing with fire. Because then what you're doing is creating a mass of people who are acting as functionaries and not as thoughtful people. All right, we're right at time, but I'm going to let Gary ask his question, and then we'll see if I have time to answer it.
Well, Roger, thank you very much. I agree with the comments made earlier that this, your own presentation and the discussion today has been particularly positive and helpful. I don't really have a question. I have an observation. And my favorite Arendt book is On Revolution. And as you were talking about the pleasure of mitmachen and so forth, what came to me was the public happiness that Arendt talks about in terms of political action, which we see in our own revolutionary tradition. And it does seem to me that we, and really kind of responding to Nancy's observation, that where we are right now with millions of people, and you mentioned the Republican Party, going along for the pleasure and good feeling that comes from being a participant in dealing with the problems of this world, finding some group, the Trump effort, that suggests that they can deal with it. We have got to have another alternative. And I would suggest it is small groups of people getting together to do politics locally, statewide, nationally, in response to the dire situation in which we find ourselves in the world. And it's just an observation. May I also just take this occasion to tell Mr. Jones that I recently took a trip to Hawaii, and on the way to the airport, the black Lyft driver started talking with me about what he was doing, and he taught dance and theater. And I said, well, wow. I said, do you know this guy, Bill Jones, by any chance? And Mr. Jones, you are beloved. He knew you and he loved you.
Nice.
Thank you, Gary. And I'm going to leave that comment because I think it's perfect. And by the way, on page 44, where she's talking about this distinction, she talks about the American Revolution. And I think Gary's insights are right. I'll simply add that for those of you who know, I'm very interested in the Arendt Center is very interested in local politics. And we're bringing next week, we will have 37 government officials from across the United States at Bard for 3 days to learn about citizen assemblies and how to run them and do them.
Sure.
So I'm very excited about that, and something we're very happy to be doing, and hopefully it will become an annual event. All right, I hope you all enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. I'm going to stick around for a couple minutes if anyone wants to talk about the book that we read next. As I said, I suggested that we read Arendt's Jewish writings, but I'm open to other suggestions as well. So thank you all very much. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and if anyone wants to stick around and make some suggestions, I'll be here. Thank you all.
Thanks, Roger.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Roger.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roger.
Thank you all.